The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long, golden beams across the carpeted floor. It was one of those rare, quiet days when the house seemed to breathe on its own, alive only with the faint creak of settling wood and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a sea of old photographs and yellowed envelopes. I didn't know why I had started organizing the boxes. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, or the way the light made the dust motes dance in the air, reminding me of time slipping through my fingers. These pictures had been tucked away for years, hidden behind the attic door, like the parts of my life I didn't know how to revisit. I picked up a photograph, the edges slightly curled from age. It was a picture of my late husband, James, leaning against the old oak tree in the backyard. His broad smile was as familiar as the smell of his cologne, and seeing it again felt like a fist tightening around my chest. He had been gone for 3 years now, but there were still days when the grief felt fresh, raw, like an open wound that refused to heal. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced up to see Gavin, his long frame filling the doorway. He looked different from when he first arrived. Less guarded, though there was still a quiet weight in his eyes that hadn't fully lifted. "Hey," he said, his voice easy but warm. "What are you up to down here?" I held up a handful of photographs. "Just going through some old memories. Thought it was time to make sense of this mess." He stepped into the room, his gaze drifting over the piles of pictures and papers spread around me. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you," he said with a faint smile. "Tell me about it," I replied, returning his smile before turning back to the photo in my hand. Gavin hesitated, lingering in the doorway for a moment before stepping closer. "Mind if I join you?" The question caught me off guard, though I wasn't sure why. He had been nothing but kind and considerate since he moved in a few weeks ago, always offering to help with chores or fix something around the house. Still, there was something about the way he asked, the way his voice softened, that made my heart skip. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the empty space beside me. He sat down cross-legged, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of him beside me. He reached for a nearby photo, holding it up to the light. "Is this you?" he asked, grinning as he studied the image. I glanced over and couldn't help but laugh. It was an old picture of me from years ago, standing in front of a snow-covered cabin, bundled up in an oversized coat. My cheeks were flushed from the cold, my hair tucked under a knitted hat. "It is," I said, shaking my head. "I'd almost forgotten about that trip." "You look happy," Gavin said softly, his grin fading into something more thoughtful. I felt a pang in my chest at his words. "I was," I said quietly. "That was a good time in my life." We fell into a comfortable rhythm after that, passing photographs back and forth, sharing stories and laughter as we unearthed moments from the past. Gavin seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my life with James, about the family gatherings, the trips, the little inside jokes captured in each picture. But as the evening wore on, the laughter faded into something quieter, more reflective. Gavin picked up a photo of himself as a young boy, standing beside James, his arms crossed in a way that seemed far too serious for a child his age. "I remember this day," he said softly. "He was teaching me how to ride a bike. I kept falling, and I got so frustrated I didn't want to try anymore." I glanced at the photo, my heart tightening. "He was patient with you," I said. "He always said you had a stubborn streak, but he admired that about you." Gavin smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the picture. "He always made me feel like I could do anything," he said, his voice tinged with quiet sadness. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fully ease the loss we both carried, the absence that had left a void neither of us knew how to fill. As the light outside began to fade, I realized how close Gavin had moved. His knee brushed against mine as he leaned over to place the photograph back on the pile, and the faint contact sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I shifted slightly, my heart beating faster than it should have. "We should probably call it a night," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but instead, he nodded and pushed himself to his feet. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "Probably." He lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting mine, before turning and walking toward the stairs. As I sat there in the quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a life I wasn't sure how to move forward from, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his presence filled the room, the way his voice lingered in my mind long after he was gone. Something was shifting, and it scared me. The next morning was one of those lazy Saturdays, where the hours seemed to stretch endlessly. I busied myself with small tasks around the house, folding laundry, dusting shelves, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. The way Gavin had looked at me when he held that photograph, the quiet sadness in his voice as he spoke about James. And then later, the way his knee had brushed against mine. The warmth of him so close. It was nothing, I told myself, just a fleeting moment, a product of two people navigating the loneliness of loss. But that didn't explain the way it lingered, or the way my chest tightened every time I thought about it. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when Gavin's voice startled me. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room. I glanced up, my heart skipping as I took him in. He was dressed casually in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Morning," he replied, leaning against the doorway. "Do you need any help with breakfast?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. "I was just about to make something simple," I said. "You don't have to." "I don't mind," he interrupted, his smile easy. "I've been living here for weeks now. I should probably contribute something other than my mess." I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. "All right," I said, nodding toward the fridge. "Let's see what we can come up with." We worked side by side, the small kitchen feeling even smaller with the two of us moving around each other. Gavin reached for the eggs while I chopped vegetables, our movements occasionally overlapping, a brush of shoulders here, a fleeting touch there. Each contact sent a spark through me, a quiet hum of awareness that I tried desperately to ignore. "So," Gavin said, breaking the silence as he cracked an egg into the bowl. "What's the plan for today?" "Nothing exciting," I said, focusing on the cutting board. "Just some cleaning, maybe a little gardening." "You've been doing a lot of that lately," he said, glancing at me. "It keeps me busy," I replied, shrugging. Gavin tilted his head, his gaze lingering on me. "You don't always have to stay busy, you know. It's okay to take a break." His words were simple, but they hit harder than I expected. "I know," I said softly, though the truth was, I didn't know how. As we cooked, the conversation turned lighter. Gavin told me stories about his college years, the friends he'd made, the embarrassing moments he still laughed about. His laughter was infectious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. When the omelets were done, we sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in through the window. "This is good," Gavin said, taking a bite. "You're a better cook than you give yourself credit for." "I had a good teacher," I replied, smiling faintly. "James loved to cook." Gavin's expression softened, and he set his fork down. "He did," he said quietly. "He always made it look so easy." "He had a way of doing that," I said, my chest tightening. For a moment, the air between us grew heavy, the weight of shared grief settling over us. But then Gavin smiled, small and genuine. "I think he'd be happy to see us here," he said softly. I looked at him, my throat tightening. "I hope so." After breakfast, we lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes and tidying up. The quiet rhythm of it, the clinking of plates, the sound of water running felt oddly comforting. At one point, Gavin reached over to grab a towel just as I moved to pick up a plate, and our hands brushed. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft, but he didn't pull away immediately. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. The quiet hum of the house, the sunlight filtering through the window, it all faded, leaving only the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand lingering against mine. "I'm glad I'm here," he said finally, his voice low. The words caught me off guard, and I felt my chest tighten. "I'm glad you're here too," I said softly. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, until I finally stepped back, breaking the connection. "I should finish cleaning up," I said quickly, turning away. "Yeah," Gavin said, his voice quieter now. I could feel his gaze on me as I busied myself with the dishes, my heart pounding in my chest. Later, when the kitchen was spotless and Gavin had retreated to the living room, I sat at the table, staring at the empty plate in front of me. Something was shifting between us, something I didn't know how to name. And it scared me. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the rolling hills beyond the house. The air was cool, with the faintest breeze tugging at the edges of the trees. I had been sitting by the window, watching the sunlight flicker across the leaves, when Gavin appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said, his voice light but insistent. "Where?" I asked, glancing up from the book I hadn't really been reading. "You'll see," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I hesitated, caught off guard by his sudden invitation. But there was something in his expression, a quiet determination, a kind of hope, that made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said, setting the book aside. We walked in comfortable silence, the gravel path crunching softly beneath our feet. The lake wasn't far, just a short stroll through the woods behind the house, but the journey felt like stepping into another world. The trees arched overhead, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. Birds called to each other in the distance, their melodies blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Do you remember the last time we came out here?" Gavin asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "It's been years," I admitted. "I think it was for James's birthday." Gavin nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, he wanted to fish, but we ended up just sitting by the water, talking about everything and nothing." A small smile tugged at my lips. He had a way of making the simplest moments feel special. "He did," Gavin said softly, his voice tinged with nostalgia. When we reached the lake, the sight took my breath away. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the vibrant colors of the trees and the sky above. The air smelled of earth and damp leaves, the kind of scent that made you feel grounded, connected to something bigger than yourself. Gavin walked ahead, his hands tucked into his pockets, and stopped near the edge of the water. I followed, my steps slow and deliberate, as though I didn't want to disturb the fragile tranquility of the moment. "This was his favorite spot," Gavin said, his voice quiet. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the water. "He loved it here," I said softly. We stood there for a while, the silence between us filled with the soft lapping of the water against the shore. "Can I ask you something?" Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Of course," I replied, glancing at him. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the water. The question caught me off guard, but the vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin turned to look at me, his expression earnest. "How do you deal with it?" I let out a soft, shaky laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know that I do," I said honestly. "I keep busy. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Gavin nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's how I've been feeling too," he said. "Like I'm just existing, not living." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You're young," I said softly. "You have time to figure it out." "So do you," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice, left me breathless. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the water as I tried to steady myself. We sat down on the edge of the lake, the cool grass pressing against my palms as I leaned back. Gavin stretched out beside me, his head tilted toward the sky. "I miss him," he said after a while, his voice barely audible. "So do I said, my throat tightening. "But being here with you," Gavin continued, his gaze shifting to me, "it doesn't feel so heavy. It feels okay." His words settled over me, warm and soothing, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that wasn't entirely painful. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin smiled then, small but genuine, and for a moment, the weight of everything else seemed to fade away. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of gold and orange, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. We walked back to the house as the first stars began to appear in the sky, the silence between us no longer heavy but comfortable, like an unspoken understanding. When we reached the porch, Gavin paused, his hand resting on the railing. "Thank you," he said softly, his gaze meeting mine. "For what?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "For coming with me," he replied. "For everything." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. As I watched him disappear into the house, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. The rain started just after dinner, a gentle patter against the windows that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and the lights flickered once or twice before settling into an uneasy glow. I had always loved storms, the way they wrapped the world in a cocoon of sound and made the indoors feel impossibly warm and safe. Tonight, though, the storm felt different. The house seemed quieter than usual, the spaces between the thunder stretches of silence that felt almost alive. I was sitting by the fireplace, a blanket draped over my legs, and a glass of wine in my hand. The flames crackled softly, their glow casting flickering shadows across the room. I had been trying to read, but the words blurred together, my thoughts too restless to focus. When Gavin walked in, I wasn't surprised. Somehow, I had known he would come. He carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, his smile easy but hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to tell him to leave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the armchair across from mine. "Of course not," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Gavin poured himself a glass, then settled into the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the angles of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes. For a while, we didn't speak. The storm outside filled the silence, the rain a steady rhythm against the roof. "You always liked storms," Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking through the quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "How did you know that?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Dad used to tell me, he said you loved sitting by the fire during storms, that it made you feel, what did he call it? Centered." A lump rose in my throat at the mention of James, and I looked away, my gaze fixed on the flames. "He was right," I said softly. We lapsed into silence again, the weight of the past settling between us like a third presence in the room. "Do you ever think about him?" Gavin asked, his voice quiet. "All the time," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "He was such a big part of my life. It's hard to imagine a day when he doesn't cross my mind." Gavin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think about him too, about what he'd say if he were here." "What do you think he'd say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I think he'd tell us to stop being so hard on ourselves," he said finally. "To stop holding on to the past so tightly that we forget how to live in the present." His words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. "He always did have a way of saying the right thing," I said, my voice trembling. Gavin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. "He wouldn't want you to feel like this," he said softly. "Like you're stuck." The honesty in his voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it was too much, too raw. I looked away, my throat tightening. "I don't know how to move on," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to let myself feel anything." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Gavin said gently. "But you deserve to feel something, Margot. You deserve to be happy." The way he said my name, soft, deliberate, sent a shiver through me. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made my chest tighten. "Gavin," I began, but the words faltered on my lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just let yourself be here. Right now." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a quiet hum that lingered long after he pulled away. The storm outside grew louder, the thunder rolling closer, but inside, the world felt impossibly still. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but unassuming, as though he was waiting for me to make the next move. I set my glass down on the table, my hands trembling slightly. "You're right," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I don't want to feel stuck anymore." Gavin's expression softened, and he leaned forward again, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness in his voice, it was enough to unravel the last thread of resistance I had been clinging to. I didn't know what I was doing, or what this meant, or where it would lead. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't drowning. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The rain hammered against the windows, thunder rumbling so deeply that it seemed to shake the floor beneath us. Yet the world inside felt unbearably still, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. Gavin's hand was still resting over mine, warm and steady. I didn't pull away, though every voice in my head screamed that I should. Instead, I stayed there, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on my chest. "You're trembling," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my fingers. "It's the storm," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't true. Gavin leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "It's okay to be scared, Margot." My breath caught at the way he said my name, the way it fell from his lips like a quiet promise. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "Just be here, right now." His words wrapped around me, warm and grounding, and I felt something inside me begin to unravel. Before I could stop myself, I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw a vulnerability in his expression that mirrored my own. "Gavin?" I began, but the words faltered as he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning for far too long. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the heat of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we broke apart, my breath was shaky, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" Gavin asked, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Because it's wrong," I whispered. "Because you're—" "Don't," he interrupted gently, his hand cupping my face. "Don't push me away because of what you think this is supposed to be." Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head. "I'm scared," I admitted. "So am I," he said softly. "But I'm not scared of this. I'm not scared of how I feel about you." His words broke something in me, and before I could think better of it, I kissed him again. This time with a desperation that startled even me. The room seemed to fade away, the storm outside a distant hum, as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were gentle yet firm, tracing a path down my back that left me breathless. I let myself feel every touch, every kiss, every whispered word, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel numb. We sank to the rug in front of the fire, the heat of the flames mingling with the heat between us. Gavin's touch was reverent, as though he were memorizing every inch of me, and I felt my walls crumble under the weight of it. "Margot," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here," I whispered, my hands threading through his hair. "I'm here." The night unfolded in a series of moments that blurred together, his lips on my neck, the way his hands trembled slightly as they roamed my body, the soft gasps that escaped my lips despite myself. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a lifeline, pulling me back to a place I thought I'd lost forever. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the rug, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as my own began to slow. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a fragile thread we were both afraid to break. "Are you okay?" Gavin asked finally, his voice low and tentative. I nodded, my fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "Neither do I," he said softly, "but I know it felt right." His words were simple, but they carried a quiet conviction that steadied me. I tilted my head to look up at him, my gaze searching his. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not for a second," he said, his eyes locked on mine. His honesty was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my fear and doubt. I rested my head against his chest again, letting the steady rise and fall of his breathing lull me into a fragile sense of peace. The fire had burned down to embers by the time we finally moved, and when we did, it was with a quiet understanding. Gavin helped me to my feet, his touch steady and grounding, and we stood there for a moment, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. "Good night, Margot," he said softly, his hand lingering on mine. "Good night, Gavin," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt a mix of emotions too tangled to name. But one thing was certain: something had changed between us, and there was no going back. The morning sunlight crept through the windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor. I woke slowly, the weight of the previous night pressing gently against my chest. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot everything. Forgot the storm, forgot the intensity of Gavin's gaze, forgot the way my name had sounded on his lips. But as reality settled in, so did the flood of emotions. Regret, fear, exhilaration. They all tangled together in a knot that tightened with every breath. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me as if it could shield me from the thoughts swirling in my head. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of birds chirping outside. I wondered if Gavin was awake, if he was downstairs waiting, if he felt as unmoored as I did. I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. I lingered longer than usual, brushing my hair, straightening the quilt on my bed, finding excuses to delay what felt inevitable. But eventually, I made my way downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The smell of coffee greeted me before I saw him. Gavin was in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured a steaming mug. He was dressed casually, the light gray t-shirt he wore clinging slightly to his shoulders. When he turned and saw me standing there, his expression softened. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He held out the mug. "Coffee?" I nodded, taking the cup from him, my fingers brushing his briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of everything we hadn't said yet. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence between us heavier than usual. Gavin sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the window, while I stared at the steam rising from my cup, trying to find the right words. "About last night," I began, my voice trembling. Gavin set his mug down, his attention snapping to me. "Margot, if you regret it—" "I don't," I said quickly, cutting him off. "I don't regret it." His shoulders relaxed slightly and the tension in his jaw eased. "Then what?" he asked softly. I let out a shaky breath, my hands tightening around the mug. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "I don't know where we go from here." "We don't have to figure it all out right now," Gavin said gently. "We can take it one step at a time." His words were simple, but they steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw nothing but patience and understanding in his expression. "Okay," I said softly, my voice barely audible. The day passed slowly, the weight of the conversation lingering between us but not suffocating. Gavin didn't push me to talk more, didn't try to define what had happened. Instead, he was simply there, his presence steady and reassuring. In the late afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, the sun casting a soft glow over the newly planted flowers. I crouched by one of the beds, pulling a few stray weeds, while Gavin worked beside me. "This looks better than I expected," he said, glancing around the yard. "You don't give yourself enough credit," I replied, smiling faintly. He chuckled, the sound low and easy. "I couldn't have done it without you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I looked at him, my gaze lingering on the curve of his smile, the warmth in his eyes. "Gavin," I began, my voice faltering. He looked up, his expression soft but intent. "Yeah?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "Thank you," I said finally, "for being here, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said softly, his voice steady. "I do," I insisted, my voice trembling, "because I don't know where I'd be if you weren't." His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment the world seemed to still. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice low but firm. I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. "I know." That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange. The air was cool, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "Do you think it'll ever stop feeling complicated?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know," I admitted, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it just is." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I can live with that." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the day settling over us like a blanket. But it wasn't a heavy weight. It was the kind that grounded you, that reminded you of where you were and where you wanted to be. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I turned to Gavin, my heart pounding. "I don't know what the future looks like," I said softly, "but I know I want to face it with you." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his touch steady and warm. "One step at a time," he said, his voice a quiet promise. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. One step at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking alone. I should have stopped talking the moment I realized how closely he was listening, but I didn't. Instead, I kept going, describing that movie scene in vivid, almost breathless detail, thinking I was just filling the silence. His eyes never left me, his fork suspended in midair, and it was only later that I understood what I'd done. That night, everything changed between my stepson and me, in a way I never imagined possible, and certainly never intended. Let me explain how we got here, because I know how it sounds. My name is Alara. I'm 53, the second wife of Dean Prescott, a man who's every bit as predictable as the steady stream of spreadsheets he brings home from his job in finance. Dean is kind in his way, reliable, but he isn't the man I married 15 years ago. Somewhere along the line, the romance disappeared, replaced by polite distance and silent evenings spent in separate rooms. I thought I was content with that, or at least resigned to it. Then Cassian moved back home. Cassian is Dean's son from his first marriage. A strikingly intelligent, reserved young man who spent the last few years in Boston, earning his master's degree. At 24, he has the quiet intensity of someone older, the kind of presence that makes you notice him even when he isn't saying much. When he decided to move back in with us for the summer, while he applied for jobs, I thought nothing of it. He was my stepson, after all, someone I'd always thought of with a kind of detached fondness. But something shifted between us that night, and it began with a conversation that was supposed to be harmless. It was a Tuesday evening. One of those uneventful nights where the three of us sat at the dinner table making polite small talk. Dean had stepped away to take a call. He was always stepping away for something. And that left just me and Cassian. The silence stretched between us, and I, foolishly trying to make conversation, brought up a film I'd watched the previous weekend. "You know, it was one of those foreign films," I said, gesturing vaguely with my glass of wine. "Beautiful cinematography, but so raw. There was this one scene, and then, as if on autopilot, I began to describe it. I don't know why I was so specific. Maybe I was trying to sound cultured, or maybe it was the wine talking. But I went into far too much detail about the way the characters circled each other, the way their touch was almost reverent before it became something else entirely. It wasn't graphic, not really," I said, my voice trailing off as I noticed his expression. Cassian was watching me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. But, it was powerful. The silence that followed was suffocating. "That sounds memorable," he said finally, his voice low and measured. I laughed nervously, waving it off. "It's just a movie." But his gaze didn't waver, and I felt something shift in the air between us, something heavy, unspoken, and undeniably dangerous. That night, as I lay in bed beside my snoring husband, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Cassian had looked at me. Not with discomfort or embarrassment, but with a quiet curiosity that made me feel both exposed and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was just a look, I told myself. Nothing more. But I was wrong. Looking back, that conversation at the dinner table was the spark that ignited everything that followed. An affair I never planned, secrets I never thought I'd keep, and consequences I never could have foreseen. If you'd told me then what was coming, I wouldn't have believed you. But life has a way of unraveling in ways you don't expect, especially when you let yourself cross a line you swore you never would. This is the story of how I let it happen. How a single moment of thoughtlessness spiraled into something I couldn't control. And how it changed everything. I thought I could brush it off. A single moment, a single look. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. But the days that followed told a different story. Cassian started lingering in the kitchen when I was cooking, asking questions about recipes he'd never seemed interested in before. He'd wait up late in the living room, book in hand, even though I could tell he wasn't reading. And when we talked, his gaze was more direct, more searching. I caught myself watching him too, noticing things I shouldn't. How the sunlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his movements. It was nothing, I told myself. Just the idle thoughts of a bored housewife. One evening, Dean announced he had to fly to Chicago for a client meeting, leaving Cassian and me alone for the weekend. I remember how quickly my heart leapt at the news, then sank just as fast under the weight of my guilt. Cass, keep an eye on your stepmother while I'm gone. Dean joked over dinner, his fork scraping against his plate. She'll probably get bored without me. Cassian smirked, his eyes flicking to mine. I'll do my best. That night, after Dean had left for his red-eye flight, I found myself in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of dinner. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. I jumped when I heard Cassian's voice behind me. You're jumpy, he said, leaning against the counter. He was holding a glass of water, though he hadn't taken a sip. I'm fine, I said quickly, turning back to the sink. There was a pause long enough that I thought he'd left the room. But then he spoke again, his tone casual. That movie you talked about the other night, what was it called? I froze, the plate in my hand suddenly feeling too heavy. Why? I was just curious, he said, stepping closer. It sounded interesting. I turned to face him, wiping my hands on a dish towel. He was closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his chin, the way his shirt clung to his chest. It's not really your kind of movie, I said, my voice coming out too breathy. You don't think so? The way he was looking at me, steady, unflinching, made my pulse race. I needed to end this conversation. I needed to walk away. But my feet stayed rooted to the floor. It's late, I said finally, avoiding his gaze. We should both get some sleep. He didn't move. You're avoiding me. I laughed nervously. Don't be ridiculous. You are, he insisted, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Ever since that night, you've been different. Cassian, you can't tell me you don't feel it too, he interrupted, his eyes searching mine. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something, anything that would put an end to this madness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, staring at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. And then he stepped closer. Say the word, and I'll walk away, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But if you don't? I didn't say the word. The first time was quick, almost frantic, a release of something we'd both been holding back for far too long. Afterward, we sat in silence on the edge of my bed, the enormity of what we'd done hanging heavy in the air. This can't happen again, I said finally, my voice shaking. He didn't argue. He just nodded, his expression unreadable, and left the room. But of course, it did happen again. And again. The days blurred together after that, each one filled with stolen moments and breathless encounters. It was a dangerous game we were playing, and we both knew it, but the risk only made it more intoxicating. We were careful. Oh, so careful. Dean was oblivious, too busy with work to notice the way Cassian and I avoided each other at the dinner table, or the way I'd rush out of a room the moment he walked in. But then came the first close call. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Dean had decided to mow the lawn. Cassian and I were in the guest house at the back of the property, a place that had become our refuge. I'd thought we had more time, but the sound of the lawnmower cutting off suddenly made my blood run cold. Shit, I whispered, pulling away from Cassian. What is it? He's coming. We scrambled to straighten our clothes, to make ourselves look presentable. I barely had time to smooth my hair before Dean's voice rang out from the doorway. There you two are, he said, stepping inside. I've been looking for you. I forced a smile, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. What's up? Lila needs help with something, he said, referring to our nosy neighbor. Cass, you mind heading over there? Sure, Cassian said easily, his tone betraying none of the panic I was feeling. As soon as he was gone, Dean turned to me, his brow furrowed. You okay? You look flushed. I'm fine, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. It's just hot in here. He didn't seem convinced, but he let it go. I watched him leave, my legs trembling beneath me. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in my mind. We couldn't keep doing this. It was only a matter of time before someone found out, before everything came crashing down. But when Cassian slipped into my room hours later, his eyes dark with need, I didn't stop him. "Just one more time," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. "I can't stay away from you." Neither could I. As the weeks went on, the tension between us became harder to hide. Dean started noticing the way I avoided his touch, the way I flinched whenever he came near me. "What's going on with you?" he asked one night, his voice tinged with frustration. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired." He didn't believe me, but he didn't press the issue. But the real trouble began when Lila, our nosy neighbor, started sniffing around. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said one afternoon, cornering me in the driveway. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too sharp. "About what?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. "Oh, nothing in particular," she said, her tone casual. "Just, you and Cassian seem awfully close these days." My stomach dropped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" she said, her smile widening. "I saw you two in the garden the other day. Looked like quite the intimate moment." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're mistaken." "Maybe," she said, her tone light but her eyes full of malice. "But mistakes can be costly, don't you think?" She wanted something. I could see it in her eyes. Money, probably. Or leverage. Either way, I knew we were in trouble. "Have a good day, Alara," she said, turning to leave. "Oh, and tell Cassian I said hi." That night I told Cassian about the conversation. "She's bluffing," he said, though his expression was grim. "What if she isn't?" I whispered. "Then we'll handle it," he said firmly, taking my hand in his. "Together." I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I knew our time was running out. If I thought Lila's veiled threat was the worst of it, I was sorely mistaken. Her meddling had merely lit the fuse on what would become an explosion far greater than I could have imagined. Cassian and I tried to maintain our careful routine. We avoided each other when Dean was around, spoke only when necessary, and kept our touches confined to the darkened corners of the house. But the tension was unbearable, and the weight of the secret grew heavier every day. Then, one evening, Dean made an announcement over dinner that left me frozen. "I've been thinking," he said, setting his fork down. "The three of us should take a little vacation. Get out of the house for a while, maybe up to the cabin in Vermont." The cabin. The tiny one-bedroom cabin nestled in the woods, with nowhere to hide and no way to escape. "That sounds great," Cassian said, his voice perfectly neutral. I envied his composure. "Doesn't it, Alara?" Dean prompted, turning to me. I forced a smile. "Sure. It'll be nice to get away." The drive to Vermont was long and uneventful, filled with Dean's monologues about work and Cassian's occasional, carefully measured responses. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, trying to calm the storm of nerves swirling in my chest. When we arrived, the cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small and rustic, with a single bedroom and a pull-out couch in the living room. Dean and I would take the bedroom, of course, leaving Cassian to sleep on the couch. At least, that was the plan. That first night, after Dean had fallen asleep, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as Cassian paced the living room. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, I slipped out of bed and crept to the doorway. He was standing by the window, his silhouette outlined by the pale moonlight. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, though there was no conviction in his voice. "I know," I whispered, taking a step closer. "Dean's right there," he murmured, his gaze flicking toward the closed bedroom door. "I know," I repeated, my voice trembling. But I didn't stop. The pull was too strong, the temptation too overwhelming. And there, in the dim glow of the cabin's living room, we broke every rule we'd set for ourselves. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was inevitable. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices. "Just seems odd, that's all," Dean was saying. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that set my nerves on edge. "What's odd?" Cassian replied, his voice calm and steady. "The way you two act around each other," Dean said, lowering his voice. "I'm not blind, Cassian." I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest. "Are you accusing me of something?" Cassian asked, his tone cold. Dean hesitated. "No, of course not. But I can't help but notice things." I stepped into the room, forcing a smile. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Dean said quickly, his expression softening as he turned to me. "I was just saying how nice it is to have Cassian here. It's been too long since we've all spent time together. I nodded, though I could feel Cassian's eyes on me. The unspoken tension was suffocating. As the days passed, the walls of the cabin seemed to close in around us. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a loaded gun. And then, on the third night, the inevitable happened. Dean had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. Cassian and I were sitting by the fireplace, the crackling flames the only sound in the room. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" he asked, though he knew exactly what I meant. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "It's too risky, we're gonna get caught." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What do you want me to do, Ilara? Pretend I don't feel this way? Pretend you don't?" I looked away, my throat tightening. "We have to stop." He reached out, his fingers brushing mine. "You don't mean that." Before I could respond, a loud thud from the bedroom made us both jump. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Cassian stood, his expression tense. "Stay here." He walked toward the bedroom, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. I watched as he opened the door and disappeared inside. A moment later I heard voices. "What the hell is going on here?" Dean's voice was low and furious, though I couldn't make out the words. I stood, my legs trembling, and crept toward the bedroom. "Think I don't see what's happening?" Dean was saying. "You're not as clever as you think, Cassian." "You're being ridiculous," Cassian replied, his voice calm but firm. "Am I?" Dean shot back. "Because I'm pretty sure I know exactly what's going on here." I pushed the door open, my heart in my throat. "Dean, stop," I said, my voice shaking. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Ilara? Do you think I haven't noticed the way you look at him? The way he looks at you?" "Dean, you're overreacting," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Am I?" he demanded, stepping closer. Cassian moved between us, his jaw tight. "Back off." Dean's eyes narrowed. "You little bastard," he hissed. "You think you can waltz in here and—" "That's enough," I shouted, my voice breaking. Both men turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. "This is insane," I said, my voice trembling. "We're family. We're supposed to be better than this." Dean stared at me for a long moment, his face hard. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. Dean knew, or at least he suspected. And now, everything was hanging by a thread. But the real twist came the next morning when I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was from Dean. "I'm leaving," it read. "Don't bother calling me. You've made your choice." I stared at the note, my hands trembling. He was gone. "What is it?" Cassian asked, appearing behind me. I handed him the note, unable to speak. He read it, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. But as I stood there, staring at the empty space where Dean's car had been, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fallout from our actions was far from over, and the consequences would be more devastating than I could have ever imagined. The silence in the cabin after Dean left was deafening. For hours, neither Cassian nor I spoke. His note sat on the counter like an accusation, its words etched into my brain. "I'm leaving. Don't bother calling me." "You've made your choice." It wasn't clear if he was coming back. He hadn't said how much he knew, only hinted. That ambiguity gnawed at me, worse than outright confrontation. But there was no denying what his sudden departure meant. Everything was unraveling, and I couldn't stop it. "Do you think he knows?" I asked Cassian finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Cassian, standing by the window with his arms crossed, didn't turn around. He wouldn't have left if he didn't. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So, what do we do now?" He turned then, his expression unreadable. "We wait. If he's gone, it's better for us to stay quiet. If we push too hard or try to find him, he'll have the upper hand." "You're talking like this is some kind of war," I said, my voice shaking. "Isn't it?" he replied, his gaze steady. "He's not coming back just to forgive us, Ilara. If he knows, he'll use it against us." I didn't want to admit that he was right. But the tension in Cassian's voice, the sharp edge of his usually calm demeanor, told me he was already planning for the worst. 2 days passed without a word from Dean. The first night was agony. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop pacing the tiny cabin, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he told someone? What if he came back with proof and used it to destroy us? Cassian tried to reassure me, but I could see the tension in his jaw every time he thought I wasn't looking. He was just as worried as I was. The second day, I heard Cassian on the phone in the other room, his voice low and urgent. When I asked him who he was talking to, he brushed it off. No one important, he said, avoiding my gaze. Cassian, don't lie to me, I said, crossing my arms. He hesitated, then sighed. I was calling a friend, someone who might be able to help us if Dean decides to escalate things. Help us how? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I don't want to be caught off guard. The first sign of trouble came on the third day. Cassian and I were in the middle of breakfast when I heard a car pull up outside. My stomach twisted as I peeked out the window and saw a familiar figure stepping out. Lila. What the hell is she doing here? Cassian muttered, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. I don't know, I said, panic rising in my chest. She's probably here to stir up trouble. Just let me handle it. Before he could argue, I opened the door and stepped outside, plastering on a polite smile. Lila, I said, forcing my voice to sound light. This is a surprise. She smiled back, though the look in her eyes was anything but friendly. Well, I was just in the area and thought I'd drop by. Check on you and Dean. It's so rare to see anyone these days. Dean's not here? I said quickly. He had to go back to the city for work. Ah, she said, her smile widening. Interesting timing. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? Oh, nothing, she said breezily, stepping closer. It's just that I saw him leave the other morning, looking quite upset. And you know me, I can't help but wonder what might have caused that. Her tone was casual, but her words carried an unmistakable edge. She wasn't here for small talk. I don't know what you're implying, I said, keeping my voice steady. Don't you? She replied, tilting her head. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and Cassian are awfully cozy without him around. I felt my stomach drop. You're mistaken. Am I? She said, her smile turning predatory. Because it seems to me that Dean's sudden departure isn't a coincidence. And if I were to start talking to people about what I've seen... She let the threat hang in the air, her meaning crystal clear. What do you want, Lila? I asked, my voice trembling. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Oh, nothing much, just a little incentive to keep my mouth shut. I told Cassian about the conversation as soon as Lila left. She's blackmailing us, I said, my hands shaking. She wants money. Cassian's expression darkened. She's bluffing, she doesn't have any proof. She doesn't need proof, I said. You know how people are around here. If she starts spreading rumors, let her, he said sharply, cutting me off. If she pushes too hard, we'll deal with her. His tone sent a shiver down my spine. What does that mean? I asked. He didn't answer. That night, I woke to the sound of voices outside. I crept to the window and saw Cassian standing with a man I didn't recognize. A tall, broad-shouldered figure with a leather jacket and an air of quiet menace. They were speaking in hushed tones, but I caught fragments of their conversation. Just keep her quiet, Cassian was saying. And if she doesn't cooperate? The man asked. Cassian's jaw tightened. Then make sure she does. I felt a wave of nausea. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but there was no denying it. Cassian was planning something, and it wasn't good. The next morning I confronted him. Who was that man? I demanded. He looked at me, his expression guarded. A friend. Don't lie to me, Cassian, I said, my voice shaking. What are you planning? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm trying to protect us, Alara. Lila's a problem, and if she doesn't back off... You can't threaten her, I interrupted. That's not the solution. Then what is? He shot back, his voice rising. Do you want to give her money? Do you think that'll make her go away? Because it won't. People like her always come back for more. I didn't have an answer. She's not going to ruin this for us, he said, his tone firm. I won't let her. Later that day, I heard from Lila again. She called me, her voice dripping with false cheerfulness. I thought we could talk, she said. Clear the air. I didn't trust her for a second, but I agreed to meet her at the local diner. I needed to know what she was planning. When I arrived, she was already seated, a smug smile on her face. Glad you could make it, she said as I sat down. Cut to the chase, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. Here's how this works. You give me what I want, and I stay quiet. It's that simple. And if I don't? She smiled, her eyes gleaming. Then I take what I know to the people who'd love to hear it. Dean, for starters. Or maybe someone else. Small towns like this, word gets around fast. I felt a wave of anger and fear. You're playing a dangerous game, Lila. So are you, she replied, leaning back in her chair. Think about it, Alara. You've got more to lose than I do. When I told Cassian about the meeting, he didn't say much. But later that night, I heard him on the phone again, his voice low and tense. Make sure it's clean, he was saying. No loose ends. I didn't know what he was planning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it would change everything. By the time I went to bed, the cabin felt like a ticking time bomb, and I was terrified of what would happen when it finally went off. The night Cassian's plan unraveled began like any other. The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I was in the living room, nursing a cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink. Cassian was out, his cryptic words earlier still echoing in my mind. Stay here. It'll all be handled tonight. I hated the way he'd said it, so cold and detached, like Lila wasn't a person, just an obstacle to be removed. But I'd let him go, afraid of the consequences if I interfered. Now, as I stared out at the dark woods, unease coiled in my stomach. When the knock came at the door, I nearly dropped my mug. My first thought was Cassian, but as I opened the door, I froze. It wasn't him. It was Dean. His coat was soaked through, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were clear as day, boring into mine. You look surprised, he said dryly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice trembling. I live here, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Or did you forget that in my absence? Dean. Save it, he snapped, shrugging off his coat and tossing it onto the couch. I know everything, Alara. My heart stopped. Everything? He smirked, but there was no humor in it. Don't play dumb. I know about you and Cassian. I know what you've been sneaking around doing behind my back. And I know about your little problem with Lila. The mention of her name made my blood run cold. How do you? Because she called me, he interrupted, his voice icy. She called me Alara, told me everything. She was kind enough to share some interesting details about what's been happening in my absence. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. Dean, Don't bother lying, he said, stepping closer. You're not as clever as you think. You thought you could humiliate me, make a fool out of me? My own wife and my own son? His words were venomous, each one cutting deeper than the last. I never wanted this to happen, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. It got out of control. He laughed bitterly. Got out of control? You think that excuses it? Dean, please, I said, my voice breaking. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Make this right? He repeated, his voice rising. You can't make this right, Alara. You've destroyed everything. Before I could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made both of us freeze. The door burst open moments later, and Cassian stepped inside, his expression dark and tense. Cassian, Dean said, his voice dripping with contempt. Right on time. Cassian's eyes flicked between us, his jaw tightening. What's going on? Oh, don't pretend you don't know, Dean spat. You and your stepmother here have been very busy, haven't you? Dean, stop, I pleaded, stepping between them. No, Dean snapped. I'm done pretending. I'm done playing the fool. Cassian, you want to explain yourself? Or should I? Cassian didn't flinch. There's nothing to explain, he said, his voice calm. You've already made up your mind. Dean's hand clenched into a fist, and for a moment, I thought he might actually hit him. But then he took a step back, his face twisting into a bitter smile. You think you're so clever, don't you? He said. But here's the thing, son, I'm not the only one you have to worry about. Cassian stiffened. What does that mean? It means, Dean said, his voice cold, that I'm not the only one Lila called. She's talking to someone else, someone who might be very interested in what she knows. Cassian's face darkened. Hell, Dean shrugged. I guess you'll find out soon enough. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Dean locked himself in the bedroom, leaving Cassian and me alone to grapple with what he'd said. He's bluffing, Cassian said, pacing the living room. He's trying to scare us. What if he's not? I asked, my voice trembling. Cassian stopped and looked at me, his expression hard. Then we deal with it. Cassian. No, he interrupted, his tone sharp. I'm not letting him destroy us, Alara. Not him, not Layla, not anyone. His determination should have comforted me, but it only made me more afraid. The next morning, the final blow came. I was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, when the sound of a car pulling up outside made my stomach twist. Cassian appeared in the doorway, his face pale. It's the police. My heart stopped. What? They're here, he said, his voice tight. Someone tipped them off. I rushed to the window and saw 2 uniformed officers stepping out of the car, their expressions grim. What do we do? I whispered. Cassian didn't answer. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Alara Prescott? One of the officers asked when I opened it. Yes, I said, my voice barely audible. We need to ask you some questions, he said. About an incident involving Lila Carter. I felt the blood drain from my face. What kind of incident? The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. She's missing. The hours that followed were a blur of questions, accusations, and rising panic. Lila was gone, vanished without a trace, and Cassian was the last person known to have had contact with her. I didn't do anything to her, he insisted, his voice steady even as the officers pressed him. She was fine the last time I saw her. But their suspicion was clear. And so was mine. When the police finally left, I turned to Cassian, my voice trembling. What did you do? Nothing, he said, meeting my gaze. You have to trust me. But I couldn't. Not anymore. In the days that followed, the weight of what we'd done and what we might still do became unbearable. Dean stayed away, the police kept circling, and the secret that had once been thrilling now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. And then one night, Cassian came to me with a plan. We leave, he said. We take what we can and disappear. Start over somewhere else. I stared at him, my heart breaking. Cassian, we can't just run away. Why not? He demanded. There's nothing left for us here. Dean's gone, Lila's gone. What's keeping us here? His words were desperate, almost pleading. But I couldn't ignore the truth. This wasn't the life I wanted. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice shaking. I can't keep running. His expression hardened. So that's it? You're giving up? I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the wreckage of what we'd done. In the end, I was left with nothing but questions. What had happened to Lila? Where had Dean gone? And what would become of Cassian? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the choices I'd made, the lies, the betrayals, the forbidden love, had led me to this moment. And now, there was no going back.